Great. Well, welcome everyone. Good to see you this morning. Morning in California, afternoon here I'm in London. So it is the afternoon in London. And Celeste, one of our speakers, Professor Renier, is also in the UK. So it's our afternoon here. We're so excited to have you join us today. My name is Paulette Brown Hines. For those of you who don't know me, I am just thankful that you're spending a little bit of your Valentine's Day, Frederick Douglass Day with us. I am one of the conductors on Footsteps to Freedom, which is a organization. My mother started actually an initiative of the Black Voice News, which is a newspaper in Southern California. The Brown family's been publishing we've been publishing for over 40 years. The paper is 53 years old. And Footsteps to Freedom is a tour that started after my mother was doing some reporting on Underground Railroad sites that she had toured as a publisher. So for 30 years, this year we celebrate our 30th anniversary. We've been taking educators and other individuals who are interested on an 8-day tour, retracing the steps of freedom seekers on our route of the Underground Railroad, which is going from Kentucky up to Canada and into upstate New York. We lead what is really one of the first interracial interracial freedom movements. And we are excited and honored that we are able to do that work. For the Frederick Douglass in Scotland tours, we're partnering with Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. We want to start what we're calling the Frederick Douglass Travel Club. Some people know he was the most photographed American of his time, but he was also the most traveled abolitionist. And the nature of his activism is global. And so he traveled here to the UK, where I am today, France, to Greece, to Egypt. And when he landed in Scotland, which you'll hear much more about from Professor Brenier, he landed there as an anti-slavery agent. This summer, I had a chance to tour with Celeste throughout Edinburgh, and we decided to make Scotland our first Frederick Douglass tour in partnership with Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. So we're really excited about that, and you'll hear why it's so special for Frederick Douglass. What I'd like to do now is introduce Kenneth B. Morris. Kenny and I, for the past 20 years, have been working together, leading along with Daniel Walker and my brother Hardy Brown, the Footsteps to Freedom tour. So we've been doing this every summer for the 20 years that Kenny's been part of the tour. And we just have always talked about doing this Douglass tour. And so Kenneth is the great grandson of Frederick Douglass, for those of you who don't know, as well as the great grandson of Booker T. Washington. And he honors that unique family history through his work with Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. So we are both excited to present the Frederick Douglass Travel Club. I'm hoping that you will be interested this tour, and we'll answer this more in the Q&A. We plan to launch in October 6th through the 11th in Edinburgh, Scotland. And we will spend time in Glasgow and Dundee and Perth, other places that Frederick Douglass visited when he was here on his first time. He was here more than once. So I will turn it over to Kenny now, and Kenny will speak for a few moments, and then he'll introduce Celeste.
Thank you very much, Paulette. And I am excited to be here. And this will be my 21st summer helping to lead the Footsteps to Freedom Underground Railroad study tour. And I also want to recognize Kennedy Schneider, who is the person that's behind the scenes for what we're doing right now, and also for our Footsteps to Freedom trip. She puts everything together, and I don't know how she does it, but she does. For those of you that don't know me, as Paulette said, I am the great grandson of Frederick Douglass, and I'm also the great great grandson of Booker T. Washington. And I always say, wow, and I pinch myself. um, I always get the question, how is it you're related to both of them? And so I'm going to start with that. It all happened on my mother's side of the family. My mother's mother, Nettie Hancock Washington, is Booker T. Washington's granddaughter. And my mother's father, Frederick Douglass III, is Frederick Douglass's great grandson. And so my grandparents met in 1941 at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which is the school that Booker T. Washington founded in 1881 at the age of 25. They happened to be on campus the same day. My grandfather was a surgeon, and he was commissioned down there by the Veterans Administration during World War II. And my grandmother had been born on campus, but she was actually living in California at the time. She just happened to be home for summer vacation and wanted to visit friends and family on campus. And my grandmother was always running late. So if you can get this visual of her rushing across campus to meet friends and my grandfather strolling coolly to get something to eat, they literally bumped into each other, didn't know that the other descended from an historic family, and they fell in love at first sight and wound up getting married just 3 months later. And when my mother was born, Nettie Washington Douglass, she's the first person to unite the bloodlines of these two historic families. She was an only child. And so when she married my father, Kenneth Morris Sr., I am the first male to carry the dual lineage. And so, of course, I'm very proud of that and feel very blessed by it. So I am also the co-founder and president of Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. It's an organization that my mom and I started in 2007. We are an abolitionist and anti-racist organization with a mission to build strong children and to end systems of exploitation and oppression. And our primary work is human trafficking prevention education in K through 12 schools. So we're continuing Frederick Douglass's anti-slavery legacy and also Booker T. Washington's education legacy, abolition through education. And we are a leader in the space of providing this education and making sure that we're reducing the vulnerability of young people to being trafficked for labor and for sex. So I want to just spend just a couple of minutes before I introduce Celeste and first talk about my great 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 grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass. Anna is a very important part of this story. And although she was not in Scotland, she and their 5 children were at home providing support as a radical freedom fighting collective. Anna has not been treated with the dignity and respect that she deserves in the story. And Douglass scholars, mostly male white scholars, have written her off and pushed her off to the side where she's not even really a footnote. She and Frederick were married for 44 years. They had 5 children together and 21 grandchildren. She was a radical freedom fighter in her own right. In fact, she was the first person in her family to be born free. And she was an entrepreneur. She was a domestic servant living in Baltimore City, where a young Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, a teenage Frederick Bailey, was enslaved. And they would meet. We'll hear more about this from Celeste, but they would meet and start to care about each other and start to think about a future together and start to fall in love. And she was one of the first people to plant the seed of thought in Frederick's mind that you're not meant to be a slave for life. I don't care what your enslaver says to you. And as they were thinking about a future together and perhaps having a family, she said, Frederick, I don't want our children's father to be a slave. She also saw potential in him. And she decided that she was going to invest in him and what he could become and his voice as a mouthpiece for his brethren, their brethren that were toiling away in chains. And so she would sell her personal belongings to help finance his escape. She would put together the sailor's disguise that he would wear. And who knows, had she not assisted him, who knows if he would have had the courage or the wherewithal to run away from slavery. And had that not happened, we would be a very different country sitting here today without the contributions of Frederick Douglass as the great abolitionist. Frederick Douglass is the first African-American nominated for Vice President of the United States, the first African-American U.S. Marshal, the first African-American ambassador and consul general to Haiti, the first African-American recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia, and the first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor. And it was not Martin Luther King that had the first statue. It was Frederick Douglass, and it was unveiled in 1899, 5 years after he had, excuse me, I'm trying to do my math, 4 years after he had passed away. And that statue still stands in Rochester, New York. And so both of my ancestors understood that education was going to be their pathway to freedom. And we know from our US history, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write. So both of them would literally have to steal their education. And for Frederick Douglass, the eventual white-haired statesman, people would ask him, where did you go to school? Where did you get your education? And we know from our US history, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write. So he was a self-taught scholar. And when people would ask him that question, he would respond on occasion by saying, my diploma is written on my back. My diploma is written on my back. And what he was talking about was the 20 years that he was enslaved. And so Frederick Douglass's story, he spent more than 50 years in public life after escaping from slavery. His story is an international story, and that's what we're here to talk about. And I'm so excited about the trip in October. My wife, Diana, and I had an opportunity to go to Edinburgh in November, and Celeste had set up just a wonderful itinerary for us. And I had an opportunity to speak at the Assembly Rooms, which is a location that Frederick Douglass spoke in at least 6 times, and to actually stand on that stage and behind that podium where my great ancestor delivered his powerful anti-slavery speeches was something that I just can't even, I can't even put to words what that meant. It was such an emotional experience for me. In fact, the whole trip, traveling to the various locations where he spoke and the number of lectures that he gave and the time that he spent there, the places where he stayed. And of course, over there, they like to preserve history a little bit more than we do sometimes here in America. So all of these locations are still places that we can visit, floors that he stood on that we can stand on. And so it's just such a beautiful trip. And I cannot thank Celeste enough for what she has done for our family. Dr. Celeste Marie Bernier, I consider the foremost Douglass family scholar in the world. She has been researching and writing about my family for more than 30 years. She's been presenting, she's published books, and she will talk about the Douglass family story, which again, the whole family was a radical freedom fighting collective, and the abolition of slavery and fighting for women's rights and human rights was the family business. And I cannot thank her enough for what she has done with her research to bring forward this history. We are working very hard to make sure that we're not only lifting up the life and legacy of Anna Murray Douglass, but also the 5 children, the 21 grandchildren, and really taking back control of this narrative, because not only has Anna not been treated with the dignity and respect that she deserves, the children have been pushed aside as almost like ne'er-do-wells in this story. And Celeste is working to change that narrative, starting with what I call the book of receipts, all of the letters that she's transcribed and the photographs, which I know those are over 1,000 letters, probably over 1,500 photographs that many of the world has not seen. And so I'm very honored to introduce you to Dr. Bernier, my good friend, and have her just walk through this history. And I know you all will be excited about it just as I am. And so, Celeste, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you very much for joining us. And one other thing I just want to mention, this is Frederick Douglass's birthday today, February 14th. It's his chosen birthday. Now, of course, he didn't know when he was born, and he selected February 14th because his mother, whom he only saw a handful of times, had brought him a heart cake one time and used to call him her little Valentine. And so February 14th is the day that he chose for his birthday. It is also the reason why we celebrate Black History Month. And by the way, we're commemorating this year 100 years of Black history, starting with Dr. Carter G. Woodson in 1926, and then President Gerald Ford in 1974 or 76, designating Black History Month. And so the reason that we celebrate Black History Month is because of Frederick Douglass's birthday on the 14th and Abraham Lincoln's birthday on the 12th. Dr. Carter G. Woodson selected that second week of February to establish Negro History Week, which is now Black History Month. So I wanted to make sure I got that in there. And Celeste, I will turn it over to you now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you so much, Paulette. Thank you so much, Kennedy. Feel so blessed and grateful to be with all of you. Thank you all so much for joining today. What a dream come true to be here on this blessed day. Thank you so much for the beautiful introduction, Ken. 24/7 for 30 years is dedicating my life to the Douglas family and your legendary, breathtaking, beautiful ancestors. And so it's a sacred privilege to be here with you all on this beautiful, precious day. And so in the time that I have, and thank you all so much for giving up your time, is I'd like to share with you some stories about Mr. Frederick Douglass in Scotland and the freedom fighting collective that is the Anna Murray and Frederick Douglass Family Liberators that Ken so beautifully talked about, and share those stories with you today. I'm going to try and share my screen, so please forgive me if I fail. Okay. Is that working?
Perfect.
Yes, we got it.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. So as Ken beautifully and powerfully and movingly said, today is a sacred day for Mr. Frederick Douglass and was protected and safeguarded by all the family as a sacred day. And Harriet Bailey Douglas Spragg, Rosetta Douglas Spragg's daughter, and named after her grandmother, Harriet Bailey, Frederick Douglass's mother, always spoke very movingly about Grandpa on this day. She always remembered that Grandpa would sit in his armchair and remember his mother, Harriet Bailey, and her extraordinary, brilliant genius in his life, and his love for her, as he said, a love undying for my mother. So today is in honor of Mrs. Harriet Bailey as well. So today I'd like to talk with you about Frederick Douglass and the international story that Ken so beautifully mentioned. Anna Murray Douglass was a queen in her lifetime, a queen of the Underground Railroad. She was famous. She was a major historical figure. At her death, there were 3,000 people at her funeral in honor of her importance. Anna Murray Douglass and Frederick Douglass, in their marriage of over 44 years, changed United States histories. Theirs was a marriage of civil rights, of human rights activism, and together the Anna Murray and Frederick Douglass School, in which all their children and descendants were educated, Rosetta Douglas Spragg, Lewis Henry Douglass, Frederick Douglass Jr., Charles Raymond Douglass, Annie Douglass, and Lewis Henry Douglass all believed in an egalitarian human rights philosophy in practice. It is never spoken about that Frederick Douglass is in Scotland solely because of the courage, beauty, genius of the beloved ones of my heart. He travels to Scotland repeatedly as part of his international freedom struggle. Anna Murray and Frederick Douglass were equal partners in civil rights history, and together they sought to effect permanent change in their fight against white supremacy, white racism, white violence, white murder, and white death. Together, they took it upon themselves to reimagine the world according to an egalitarian human rights reality. And part of their mission was for Frederick Douglass to come and tell that story internationally. As he said, I will shame the United States on an international stage. So part of what we will speak about today is exactly that story. So Frederick Douglass spends many times visiting Scotland during his lifetime, and just to share some of his words for us on our journey. I am now in old Scotland, where every hill, mountain, stream, and river has been caught in the bloody conflict over freedom and slavery. Frederick Douglass repeatedly visits Scotland in 1846 and 1847, in 1859 and 1860, and then in 1886 and 1887. And he travels the length and breadth of Scotland. I now take the view that let's assume he was everywhere. So Frederick Douglass traveled from Inverness to Edinburgh, to Dumbarton, to Fenwick, to Stonehaven, to Aberdeen, as he said, telling the story of the liberation story of my people. Frederick Douglass traveled to Glasgow, Aberdeen, Arbroath, Perth, Dundee, many of the places Paulette has beautifully mentioned at the start, and he courageously sought to tell the story to all the hills and valleys and streams of Scotland. Frederick Douglass warred against the racism not only of white enslavers in the US South, but he and Anna Murray Douglass warred against the racism of white anti-slavery campaigners who pretended abolition only to practice injustice. So Frederick Douglass was given a route by white abolitionists about where he could go in Scotland, drink tea, talk to mayors, be part of an elite white group, and he rejected it. He hired a horse and he traveled to communities where workers in Scotland were living in destitution, were starving, were in poverty. His grandchildren later, years later, when he would play so many Scottish airs on his violin, that was his deepest joy, they said that an expression of feeling would follow down Grandpa's cheek as he remembered the suffering of the people of Scotland. So Frederick Douglass was absolutely dedicated to fighting injustice and inequality wherever he traveled, and the streams and valleys and hills of Scotland with their injustice and their violence were a part of his international story in the fight for human rights. Frederick Douglass spoke repeatedly about the struggles in Scotland for freedom, and during his journeys, he especially spoke of these are the Grampian Mountains, extraordinarily, breathtakingly beautiful. And Frederick Douglass wrote a very powerful letter about his feelings on being in the Grampian Mountains. And you can see here on the top right of the Grampian, you see they divide East and West Scotland. They're in the middle right there. Frederick Douglass spoke and said, I, the other day, had the privilege to see the Grampian Mountains that divide the west from the east of Scotland. The ancient crowned kings and queens used to meet to discuss the struggle in the deadly conflict for liberty or slavery. Their fight for supremacy caused the very blood of the hills to run, each warming their hearts with each other's blood. Frederick Douglass saw Scotland as a nation, as a space and place of self-liberation, of resistance, of radicalism, as part of the African diaspora movement, past, present, and future, in the freedom struggle, as he described it, of all freedom's battlegrounds. In particular, Frederick Douglass, still to this day in Scotland, was a celebrity and remains a celebrity, very powerfully because of his association with James Douglas, a white Scottish leader, and where Frederick Douglass, as we all know, took his name. The fact that Frederick Douglass chose to rename himself in self-liberation as James Douglas was very much at the beating heart of his fame, renown, and his political strategic direction in Scotland. He said, writing in Scotland again in 46, and this is in July, he says, I feel myself almost a new man in Scotland. He also writes an imaginary letter to one of his white persecuting enslavers in Maryland. And he tells him, you remember when I used to meet you in St. Michael's on that old dusty road. You remember that I didn't have at that time the ability to look you in the face. If I should meet you now in the rolling hills of Scotland, I would not only look you in the face, but I would treat you as James Douglas treated the English, were you to attempt to make a slave of me. You would find that I would be as resistant as he was to the English. So Frederick Douglass saw in Scotland a very important mythology of radicalism and resistance in the fight for justice and the fight against inequality everywhere. He talked repeatedly in Scotland and said, I come here to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. He also told Scotland of its obligations. He said that you have had something to do here in Scotland with the enslaving of my race. Therefore, you can be responsible for doing something to end the enslaving of my race. He also repeatedly said in the streets of Scotland, who would debate slavery over liberty? Everyone's human given right is to liberty. I will not debate that in front of you this evening. What you're looking at here is 33 Gilmore Place. That's how it looked in Mr. Frederick Douglass's time. And here, Frederick Douglass wrote many, many letters. This is one of those letters, writing to friends back in the United States. And in this powerful letter, he issues one of his many declarations of liberation and his proclamations in the fight for justice. Here he says, "No man has power over the human spirit." It's from this space and place, I like to call it his command center of revolution, that he directed the publication of his autobiographies, that he instructed publishers to print the word only to be spoken and written by me, and where he rejected, edited, threw away, and protested any violent caricatures of my face in any dehumanizing photographs. This is how the building looks today. And in honor of Frederick Douglass's own proclamations in Scotland, where in his fury to white racists in Scotland, he turned on them and said, "I am the real American." So here we honor him as American author, orator, philosopher, freedom fighter, and statesman. And in this very same building, he wrote, "My part has been to tell the story of the slave." Frederick Douglass spoke in cities, towns, and villages and took himself to emotional, physical, and personal breaking point. His letters back home to the beloved ones of his heart, Anna Murray Douglass, Rosetta Douglass Spragg, Lewis Henry Douglass, Frederick Douglass Jr., Charles Raymond Douglass, and Annie Douglass, tell of his struggle, but tell of their union together across those 3,000 miles, keeping him alive. As we all know, Anna Murray Douglass's artistry and genius in how she created and designed his fashion, his self-fashioning strategies in his photographs, meant that stitching in the clothes together meant that they were always together despite their many thousands of miles apart. Here in Glasgow, Frederick Douglass condemned anyone who wanted to believe in Scotland as a nation of liberation. He said, "You have been complicit in the buying and selling of my people. You will be responsible in the changing and the fight for equality and human rights." In churches, he spoke repeatedly about the injustices of religious belief systems that were based in religious hypocrisy. As his daughter, Rosetta Douglass Spragg, repeatedly proclaimed, "Religion is a cloak for sin." Frederick Douglass, during his time in Scotland, endured many difficulties and many challenges. And among his many descendants, there are powerful letters talking about the severe trauma he experienced. He was away from the beloved ones of his heart for days, months, and years because of the difficulties and struggles he faced. Every day was a battleground, as he described it. There is a very powerful moment in Edinburgh when Frederick Douglass writes a letter back home to Anna Murray Douglass, and he tells her, "I felt real low spirits today." He said, "There is no living for me." Frederick Douglass repeatedly battled with post-traumatic stress disorder, and as he said, I suffer and I am strong because I have the love of the beloved ones of my heart." Anna Murray Douglass and all his children wrote back letters of support, keeping Mr. Frederick Douglass emotionally, politically, and personally alive. During one of these terrible moments of sorrow and struggle, Frederick Douglass always practiced strategies of resistance and radicalism. He tells a powerful story many years later when he felt he could speak about his experiences, where he traveled down the city of Edinburgh in one of the many high streets, and in a large store, I saw a fiddle in the window. I bought that fiddle, I brought it back to my hotel, and I played and I played and I played, and my heart was free, and I felt as loving as a lamb and lively as a critic. So Frederick Douglass's experience of music in the city of Edinburgh and across Scotland was very important. So he traveled across the nation from Arbroath. This is the train station in Arbroath in the middle of Scotland, and painted on the walls were the slogan, "Send back the money." Now, Send Back the Money was a campaign that Frederick Douglass was involved in while he was in Scotland. You see here standing next to Mr. Frederick Douglass is Thomas Chalmers, as Frederick Douglass immortalized, "A white enslaver by any other name." Thomas Chalmers was a white religious minister, as he called himself, and he was the founder of the Free Church of Scotland. As Frederick Douglass described it, never was a church more wrongfully named. You see today in Edinburgh the statue of Thomas Chalmers, and it's even more powerful, even more poignant, even more beautiful and revolutionary that Ken, your beautiful speech was just outside this statue that still stands in Edinburgh. Frederick Douglass educated all audiences about who the Free Church of Scotland were. This is a man he called and identified as Brother Lewis in a satire and performance he gives repeatedly through the nation. Frederick Douglass would tell his audiences and say, those of you who are profiting by trading in human trafficking, those of you that are taking the blood-stained money of human traffickers from Louisiana, from Maryland, from Georgia and Alabama, disgorge the plunder. You are buying and selling me. So in repeated speeches, he would give for his audiences a performance where he talked about, imagine what it looks like to give money to the cause of the Free Church of Scotland. Imagine Brother Lewis coming to my former enslaver, Thomas Auld, and imagine him asking for money from Thomas Auld. Thomas Auld would say, I have no money, but I tell you what, come back at 9 o'clock tomorrow, these are Frederick Douglass's exact words, and I will find that money for your cause of freedom in Scotland. How does he find the money? He finds the money by buying and selling me. Make no mistake, people of Scotland, when you buy and give money to the Free Church of Scotland, you are selling my bones, my spirit, my soul, my person. And at that point, Frederick Douglass becomes a national figure in Scotland by monumentalizing the Send Back the Money campaign. This is one of many songs that is demonstrated across Scotland. And you see at the bottom, enter Frederick Douglass, I say send back that money. The buildings are still there. The train station, send back that money, was written in red paint. So many people would wake up in the morning, white enslavers profiting from money in the Caribbean, and they would find that their stoops to their door have been painted blood red overnight. Frederick Douglass worked with two white Scottish abolitionists, Jane and Eliza Wigham, and they together climbed Arthur's Seat, which you see in this picture here, and together with children who were living in unhoused communities on that building, they were destitute, they had nothing, and their love for Frederick Douglass was so great, they helped him, and together they carved Send Back the Money onto the very landscape of Scotland, was Frederick Douglass's words. Many, many, many years later, in 1886, he remembers, he says, I climbed again Arthur's Seat. I could find no trace of our slogan. For Frederick Douglass, writing into the very hills and valleys and streams of Scotland, Send Back the Money, was a proclamation to liberation. It was a proclamation to the fight for Scotland to take accountability, to take responsibility for its current, past, and future injustices. As he, over the years that he's in Scotland, he is always inspired and kept alive by Mrs. Anna Murray Douglas, Queen of the Underground Railroad, regionally, nationally, and internationally. Together, as Ken beautifully said, they are a freedom-fighting collective working side by side with their children, Lewis Henry Douglas, Charles Raymond Douglas, Rosetta Douglas Spragg, and Annie Douglas. Together, they are freedom fighters with Charles Raymond Douglas in the fight for revolution. The beautiful words, I think, of Frederica Douglas Spragg Perry, the granddaughter, one of the eldest children of Rosetta Douglas Spragg, as she describes it, they were a united child and adult power. In the many trips that Frederick Douglass takes to Scotland, he takes a trip in 1859, again as a liberation moment in the wake of John Brown's Revolutionary War on Harper's Ferry. At this time, he comes to the small town of Ayr, which is the river you're looking at here. And at this point, he remembers what happens to him with his youngest daughter, Annie Douglas. You saw Frederick Douglass's letter that he writes while he's in Scotland. Annie Douglas writes a letter to her father while he is in Scotland. Annie Douglas was an intellectual protege, a linguist, an orator, a freedom fighter, a philosopher, and a thinker. And in her 10 years, 11 months, and 21 days on this earth, she gave her life to the freedom movement. This letter that she writes her father while he's in Scotland tells him about her anti-slavery oratory. She tells him that her German skills are so brilliant that they're already going ahead of the German children who've already been longer in school than her. And she also writes about telling him about, I've learned another piece and it is anti-slavery. He is not the man for me who buys and sells a slave. So the youngest abolitionist and freedom fighter in the family, dedicating her life to the cause of freedom. In the bottom of this letter, you'll see too that she talks about what has just happened to John Brown. Poor Mr. John Brown, that hard-hearted man, said he must die, and they took him in an open field and about a half mile from the jail and hung him. Anna Murray Douglas and Annie Douglas were the freedom fighters at home when John Brown spent months, days, years living in the home, contrary to popular belief. And together they were the advisors, political thinkers working side by side with John Brown. When Frederick Douglass is in Scotland on the second visit, this time in Ayr, this is the building where he speaks again. He'd spoken there in 1846. And if you can imagine, he spoke there to 2,000 people. So there's 2,000 people in this small church building. At this time, Frederick Douglass experiences absolute, terrible mind, body, soul-killing depression. It's at this time when he's speaking to 2,000 people that, as you see in this newspaper report written by a white Scottish journalist, that he has just received the letter that Annie Douglas has passed away at 10 years, 11 months, and 21 days. You see in the middle of this report, he said he had that morning received a letter from America bringing the melancholy tidings of the death of one of his family, a girl, a child of years of age, the light of the family. One white Scottish abolitionist talks about Frederick Douglass trying to give his speech. This white Scottish male journalist says, "We saw the great man get up, stand up, speak, sit down. We watched him do it multiple times." Frederick Douglass then flies to his sorrow-stricken family. This building is still there to this day and very much is a building that is part of the Anna Murray and Frederick Douglass family liberation movement and is a building sacred to the liberation struggle, past, present, and future. I said at the beginning that Frederick Douglass took it upon himself to ignore white elitist, persecutory abolitionists who preached equality only to practice injustice, and went and spoke to all communities across Scotland. And in my years of working in Scotland, I have met many people who remembered over generations Frederick Douglass coming to their communities. Frederick Douglass came and spoke to weavers, came and spoke to children, came and spoke to women, people of all genders and all ages, and empathized with them in their grief. There is a very powerful moment that happens on Gore Street in Paisley that you can see here. And this is just after Frederick Douglass has received the mind, body, soul-killing news of his daughter's death. An elderly washerwoman since 1846 has been saving her money and comes to see him again in 1859. We don't know her name, but she comes up to Frederick Douglass and she tells him, "In admiration of your struggle, but with all my poverty, I give you my 10 shillings. Frederick Douglass, a grieving father, turns to her, and as he remembered, he said, "I said to her, the first freedom seeker that comes to our home and our family, we will give them this money in full and we will tell them your story." For Frederick Douglass, working as part of the Anna Murray and Frederick Douglass Family Liberation Collective, Scotland and the international story and the local, regional and national spaces and places in Scotland our spaces of liberation and of struggle and of freedom. He worked side by side and later remembered the many more people that also came to Scotland. Jesse Glasgow Jr., a writer, a thinker, an intellectual, won all the prizes at the University of Edinburgh with his mathematical and scholarly genius, and wrote one of the first histories of John Brown's War. Ira Aldridge, world-acclaimed performer, brilliant tragedian, one of Frederick Douglass's, as he later said, dearest best friends. Sarah Parker Remel, coming to Scotland to speak, to educate audiences on the plight of women and children living in enslavement and of their resistance strategies in the struggle for liberation. Charles Lennox Remond, educating Scottish audiences internationally about the inequalities of class systems that dehumanize and destroy. Josiah Henson repeatedly had his photograph taken in Scotland and came there repeatedly with his wife, Nancy Henson, speaking of the Dawn settlement and their fight for equality and education in international liberation movements. Ellen and William Craft also came repeatedly in the city to tell their story and the setting up of their education systems and their schools in the UK. William Wells Brown came and spoke of medical students, he said, arm in arm in Scotland, who are fighting back to the inequalities of Louisiana and the injustices, the exclusions, where we are murdered and killed for our fight for education. Amanda Berry Smith came to preach religious equality and the fight for justice in creating spiritual coalitions internationally. Samuel Ringgold Ward, also a Marylander, came to Scotland to tell Scotland of its violence. As he said, your hands are drenched in blood. You change it and you change the universe. Frederick Douglass wrote letters of introduction just before he died for Ida B. Wells, who carried on his mission. As he said, when people were telling him that he should leave Scotland because he was exposing the Free Church of Scotland, he said, I will never leave. I will stay here. I mean to agitate, agitate, agitate the old people of Scotland. Here you see some of the maps in the city of Edinburgh as we continue to tell the story of Frederick Douglass. I mean to stay here in old Scotland and tell Scotland that the question is not slavery or liberty, the question is humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Celeste. And if you can imagine, when I was here in July, when I was in Edinburgh in July, we did a 3-hour walking tour with Celeste, and it was wonderful to see. And there's this great mural of Frederick Douglass that was right down the street from my Airbnb, and I didn't know that's the street that he lived on when he was there. I had no idea until Celeste took us. So thank you so much, Celeste. Thank you for everyone who joined us. Like I said at the beginning, we plan on touring Edinburgh and the surrounding cities of Scotland with Celeste and Kenneth, October 6th through the 11th this year. I'm sure you had a chance to go to the website, Douglass Travel Club, and you can see more information. We want to open it up for questions that people might have.